All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Welcome to the September Community Update webinar. We're going to cover a lot of great information today. So for those of you who are watching live, if at any point you have any questions, please make sure to use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to send in your questions. With that, we can get this show on the road. I would like to introduce our National Volunteer Advocacy Committee co-chair, Kirk.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome to the September version of the Advocacy update. My name is Kirk Astroth. As you can tell, I'm one of the co-chairs along with Brittney, householder for the National Volunteer Advocacy Committee. I live in Tucson, Arizona. I'm a person with CF, and really pleased to be able to kick off this webinar today. I wanted to start and just give recognition to the entire CF community for all that you did to try to support Medicaid funding in the last legislative cycle. We had an incredible effort where many of you showed up to be heard, to help our elected representatives hear from constituents about the importance of Medicaid to the CF community. You provided stories, you made phone calls, you scheduled virtual visits with representatives, all to try to preserve the funding for the Medicaid program that's so important to us. And it's a testament to how close this vote was, because the vice president had to cast a breaking tie vote here at the end to pass the big ugly bill that Congress was considering. And so even though we can feel a sense of defeat at what happened with the Medicaid funding, I'm really proud. I think all of us are very proud of the CF community and all that you did to try to preserve that funding for Medicaid. But, you know, like CF, our legislative fight is far from over. It continues. We've got to do some new advocacy efforts coming up now. The proposed Trump budget also has some cuts to FDA and NIH, which you'll find out today are incredibly important to the CF community. So we've got another challenge in front of us here before the 1st of October to again try to schedule meetings as you've done during the August recess, or request time to speak with your congressional representatives to let them know how important NIH and FDA funding is to our community. So again, I want to just say everything that all of you did really did make a difference. And while we didn't get the outcome we were hoping for, Congress certainly heard from the CF community loud and clear, and we have a chance to do that again. I wanted to share a quote I found from Maya Angelou that I think says a lot about this current situation we're in right now. And she wrote, "You may encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated. In fact, it may be necessary to encounter defeats so you can know who you are, what you can rise from, and how you can still come out of it." I think the key to success in our case is action, and the essential piece of action is perseverance. And that's what we're looking at as we head into this next funding challenge to preserve funding for NIH and FDA. So thanks for all you've done. Thanks for the efforts that you'll do here in the future for the entire CF community. It means a lot. It's really important. And while we may not win every battle, we're in this for the long haul to win the outcome, to end CF here in this country and around the world. With that, I'll turn it over to Dave Ellen, who will pick up from here.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Kirk. Appreciate you and your leadership and all you've done. Um, Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. For those of you I've never met, my name is Dave Elin. I lead advocacy and government affairs here at the CF Foundation. And I'm honored to be here with you today and to share a little bit about some of the work that you've done, some of the stuff that Kirk has noted, and to talk a little bit about sort of what we see coming, and then really kind of shift us into the fight that Kirk just talked about, which is really preserving funding for the NIH and the FDA, which is incredibly important to our community and to our path to a cure. So with that, let me talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. Again, I think we're going to give you a snapshot of what's going on right now. We're going to have Dr. Katherine Tuggle, our colleague from our research affairs team, share some in-depth stuff about the NIH and the FDA, and then we're going to talk about how you can help. So let me just take us back a quick step. As Kirk noted, this community showed up in incredible ways in trying to protect access to coverage for people with cystic fibrosis. And unfortunately, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed and was signed into law on July 4th by the president. It does make some significant changes, some changes to the Medicaid program and to the marketplaces. That said, it is going to take the government quite some time to implement these changes, and they are staggered on timelines. And we can talk about that later. But for what I think is important for folks to know is that our focus, the CF Foundation's focus, is going to shift from Congress in this space, from Congress to the administration, to working with the Department of Health and Human Services and CMS, which is the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, and to states, and to really try and mitigate coverage losses for people with cystic fibrosis. And again, this is going to be a long effort over the course of the next several months and years ahead. And if you know anything about the CF Foundation, you know us, we're going to fight tooth and nail to try and mitigate the impact to our community. I want to quickly reflect on how much you all did, and you can see some numbers on the screen here on the slide in front of me in terms of how CF advocates showed up to protect the community. And I just want to reiterate that what Kirk said was that it made a huge difference. If we hadn't done what we did, if we hadn't been on the phone sending 21,000 messages to Congress, spending hours and hours on the telephone trying to explain to lawmakers how important Medicaid and marketplace coverage is for people living with cystic fibrosis, we wouldn't have had this vote for this bill come down to a tiebreaker in the United States Senate, which of course was the Vice President of the United States to tie the vote. And I truly believe that your stories, your calls, your actions, the meetings you did back at home in districts, here in Washington, D.C., all made a huge difference in making that really come down to the final to the wire, to a tiebreaker vote. And that leaves me with great hope. That leaves me with great hope that we can continue to do big things in defense and of our community and to advance our cure for CF. So I'm incredibly encouraged by these numbers and what you all did. And I think, we can take that energy and really, harness it and move it into what's next. So that said, what is next? We are right now in sort of the final throes of government funding. Government funding is set to run out at the end of the month. It's 20 days away, less than 20 days now, if you count. We're 3 p.m. here or 3:10 in Washington, D.C. And so Congress has to decide, are they going to do what's called a continuing resolution? Are they going to pass a full year budget? A continuing resolution, sort of continues funding intermittently or for shorter periods of time. If you remember, funding was set to run out in March of this year, and they extended it to September 30, and here we are. So That means, important programs, important agencies like the NIH and the FDA. It also means, things like extended advanced premium tax credits that allow people to get an advanced tax credit for purchasing insurance plans on the individual marketplace on healthcare.gov and depending on their income level. All of that's sort of set to expire on September 30th. So there is a big conversation right now in Washington around, is that going to get pushed out until November, December, through January? Some folks want to do a full year extension. But those details remain to be seen. And I will say that, and many of you read just as much as I do and see the news, but what we're hearing, in addition to those, what's public, is that these factions in both parties are quite far apart. So all to say, the process is moving a little bit more slowly than we would hope. In terms of appropriations, and this is where funding for the NIH and the FDA really, this is where our advocacy is really vital in keeping these agencies afloat and funded. The House, or so the president has indicated he wanted a 40% reduction in funding for the NIH and almost 12% below the current levels for the FDA. We saw yesterday that the House LHHS committee passed their budget, which is or passed their bill that has pretty level funding, and the Senate version is just a little bit off of that. So the House and the Senate are just a little bit off of each other, but they are way off of the president's budget. Now, the president's budget is just a marker. It's what he would like to see. But remember, Congress holds the power of the purse, and it is their job as a co-equal branch of government to pass funding that then the administration is to push out. So our first job is to get them to pass the funding levels that we need, and then our next job is to have them to hold the administration accountable to pushing that funding out and to spending it in the ways in which Congress intends it to be spent. So that leads me into what we need to do. We need to protect these agencies, and we're going to talk more about how you can do that. And we've got to make sure they're fully funded, because the path to a cure for cystic fibrosis begins at the NIH and flows through the FDA and gets those drugs on the shelves, and we'll get that cure on the shelf for you and your loved ones. And I'm delighted to have with us today our colleague, Dr. Katherine Tuggle from our research affairs team, who does a lot of this work, who has been involved deeply in it. And she's going to come on and share really the value of the NIH and what it does for our community and why it's so important, to give you some fodder for your advocacy as you move forward. So Katherine, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave, for that setup. And I'm really going to take the next 15 or 20 minutes or so to run through what we view as kind of the importance of the FDA and the NIH and really kind of how we work with them to achieve our mission. So like I said, to kind of follow on all the appropriations discussions, really what's at stake, especially if the funding levels do get cut to the levels that have been proposed in at least the president's budget. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I think it's important to kind of set the stage. I think many people know in general what the NIH is, but I don't think people realize that it is currently the largest public funder of biomedical and behavioral research in the world. And this has really been a driving force behind decades of advancements that have improved health and have really revolutionized science really worldwide. So we're very fortunate to have an agency such as that in the United States to really help support our research institutions and really help advance science right here in our backyards. I think it's really important also to realize that the NIH supports a full spectrum of scientific research. And I really like this figure that I put up here on the slide that was modified a little bit from the NIH, but it shows when we talk about research, we talk about bench to bedside a lot of times. So thinking about very early stage research, which we call bench research or basic research, which is the foundational science really behind a lot of discoveries that eventually we hope will make it to the clinic. But the NIH will start with funding basic fundamental science. They'll fund preclinical research, so research that is really before you start getting to patients, then transitioning into clinical research. So when we start to test these advances in people, and then also implementation science or clinical implementation. So this is once you've gone from a very clean clinical study into more practical or more widespread use of a scientific finding, discovery, therapy, multiple different types of efforts in the space. And then you get into what's called real world research, which is just the general population and how drugs or how these discoveries kind of affect the whole world. And all of these types of research really feed into each other, inform each other, and go back and forth. So it's not just one continuum, but really this kind of cycle of research that really helps to move us forward faster and take things that we learn at one stage, bring it back, see if we can iterate and make it better. And really the NIH is involved in all aspects of this research. And I think what's also really important and what I love about this figure is it's all centered around the patient. And so when you're thinking about these findings, once we realize that something may go from a very basic science discovery into something that could be translational to the clinic, it's bringing that patient voice in and really understanding how that patient can really be centered in that research. So I think it's important to understand that it's not just one point in which the National Institutes of Health comes in, but they really fund this full continuum that's so important for advancing science in general. They also play a key role in supporting training for our next generation of researchers and clinicians. And I think this is also a really important topic. And I'll get into this a little bit further in one of the subsequent slides. So next slide, please. So I think it's really important to point out from the get-go that the foundation does not have any direct impact on the research that is funded by the NIH. So when the NIH receives grant applications or decides to give funding, that is a completely independent process, and we do not have a role in that. However, many of the researchers that we work with do actually have a role in that, and I'll explain that a little bit more in the next slide. Also, the CF Foundation does not receive any funds from the NIH to support our research. So everything that we do is funded with our dollars, everything that they do is funded with their dollars, but we work together and really depend on both or really multiple organizations, but especially the NIH, to be well functioning in order to have an ecosystem that is able to support research across the entire biomedical landscape. And this is what helps us support a lot of our advances. I think it's important to also just kind of highlight how this has worked in the past, especially in CF. So a lot of foundational work that was supported by the NIH in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even up until now has really led the way for a lot of the CFTR modulating drugs that we see in the clinic today and that many people with CF are benefiting from. And so some of the work funded by the NIH back in the 1970s and early 80s helped us to understand about the movement of salt or ions across cells and tissues. And this started to describe some of the pathology that we see in CF. That really led to some of the foundational understandings and really laid the groundwork for us to discover the identification of the CFTR gene, which was in 1989. That work was also supported by the NIH. As we went through the 90s and early 2000s, the NIH spent a significant amount of resources funding labs around the country where we understood how mutations in the gene actually affected the function of CFTR. And this, kind of led the way for us to understand that it wasn't going to be a one-sized approach for fixing CFTR and developing these modulating drugs, but instead it identified those different classes of mutations that we hear about. And so this work was really instrumental in helping to kind of build the knowledge base that ultimately led to the development of these therapies. And even today, the NIH continues to fund large amounts of work on biology and understanding different organ systems that are impacted by CF that may also help us really lay the groundwork for developing therapies for gene editing, gene delivery, that really are going to be important for us as we move forward. Again, all of these things are very expensive, require large groups of researchers. And so it's not something the CF Foundation can do alone. And we really depend on the NIH supporting that broader ecosystem and that larger group of researchers in order to make sure that we are able to be successful in advancing some of these new therapies and these new discoveries to where we can start translating them to that preclinical and clinical space that I mentioned on the previous slide. Next slide, please. So I think it's important. I live in the research world, so we just talk about grants all the time and assume everybody knows what a grant is. But I think it might be important to understand when you hear about these budgets and you hear about the NIH getting funding, where does that money go? And how is that actually used? So the vast majority of the NIH's budget is used to support external grants to investigators, mostly in the United States, but some a little bit outside of the country, to advance research projects. And they really come in three big flavors. There's a lot of different types and a lot of nuance, but I would say the bigger categories that you have are what we call investigator-initiated research grants. And these are typically a principal investigator or researcher will come up with a great idea. There will be a request for application that comes out from the NIH, and they'll apply for it saying, I see this problem, and this is my solution to the problem, and here's how I propose to do the research. And then I'll run through the process in a second on exactly how that gets evaluated. But that's really kind of the bread and butter of research grants and funding that comes out from the NIH. There's also program grants or kind of more infrastructure institutional support grants. There are a fair number of these that are actually used to support CF research. The main flavor of these is called a P30 grant, but they support larger institutions. I think there's about 10 or so of them around the country that will pay for course support, training programs, pilot and feasibility programs to really kind of build a research program at an institution, bringing lots of investigators in together. And it's not so focused on a project, but it's more focused on a theme of research and supports a larger number of investigators. And then there are training grants. And these are critical grants for supporting individuals in their graduate medical school postdoctoral training as they begin to kind of launch their independent careers and move into where they can apply for those investigator-initiated studies. And those can go to the individual themselves or to institutions. And I think it's really important to note that for many of our PhD and MD colleagues that are kind of coming up through the ranks, those that are coming through their training programs, a lot of those are supported through these training grants. And I know that there have been a number of cuts that have happened in the course of the past 8 months or so to training grants. And this is something that has been a big concern for our group, is we realize we may not see the direct impact of those grants now, but it may actually end up being in more 10 or 20 years down the road that we don't have the investigators we need to be able to do the research that is important for our field to advance. So we're really keeping an eye on this and really trying to make sure that we're supporting a robust training environment so that we don't see these kind of lags down the road. So what I wanted to mention, this is a very busy chart on the side, and I apologize for that, but I think it shows really nicely the life cycle of a grant. So as I mentioned, typically what the NIH will do if they want to solicit applications, they have kind of broad announcements that are posted every year on I think 3 times a year cycle typically, where investigators can come in and say, I see this, I want to understand CF-related diabetes and, the population, understand how it's being developed or who's most at risk for it. And so you may say, here's the specific hypothesis I have. I think that X factor is resulting in people being at risk of CF-related diabetes. And here's how I propose to study it. And you write this really long grant application. You put lots of materials in. It takes a long time to put together. It gets submitted, which is kind of that lighter blue box on the right-hand side, kind of at the 2 o'clock position. And then that application goes to the NIH and is sent out for external review. The external review is conducted by researchers from around the country and around the world who are really experts in that area. They come in, evaluate the science, score the approach, score the individuals. So there's a lot of kind of factors that are taken into consideration, and a score is given to that application. And then those that score the highest, typically in about the 10 to 12-ish% of the grants, those actually end up getting awarded or get pushed forward for receiving a grant. If somebody is selected for a grant, they receive a notice. That is a very good day for them. They get to pursue not only the research that they're wanting to pursue, but they've got funding to really kind of help advance a new research base that I think is really important and why so many people go into science to begin with. And then those grants are normally over multiple years, so 3 to 5 years for a grant. At the end of their first year, they will come back into the agency and submit a progress report that says, here's all the work that I accomplished. Thank you for the money. Here's what I did. Here's what I'm going to be doing the next year. Just making sure you're on track and keeping with what you had proposed to do and what you're supposed to be doing. And this continues to get evaluated internally at the NIH throughout the course of the grant. And so it's not that they get a check at the beginning and they get to walk away. It's that they constantly have these check-ins and make sure that the science is advancing in the way that they expect it to. So there's a fair amount of oversight that goes on with the grant. So it is a fairly long, complex process, but really this is how research is funded and research is supported in the United States through the NIH. So I think that's just really important to let people know, kind of when we talk about a grant, that's the process that goes in, and I'm happy to answer additional questions about that later on, or people can reach out to me separately. But that's one way that research is really supported through the NIH. Another way that the NIH has been very successful in kind of pushing research forward, maybe in more of a, or less in a monetary fashion, is they also support workshops. And this is an area where we have had a fair amount of impact over the years. We have co-organized a number of workshops working with different institutes at the NIH. Some of the ones that are listed here are workshops that we've done in about the past 5 to 6 years. And I think have been really instrumental in helping to advance the field and identify real research priorities that in some cases the NIH has been able to go back and get special topic RFAs to help support research in these spaces. So again, showing just the critical importance of the NIH, making sure that they are functioning, they're funded, they're functioning properly, and they're able to do the charge that they've been, charged with for decades, that they're able to continue doing that, because so many of the institutions and really the science ecosystem in general depends on that system continuing to work in order to continue to move us forward. We can go to the next slide. We're going to shift gears and talk about the FDA a little bit. My apologies for the dry throat. So in the next couple of minutes, I'll just talk very briefly about the Food and Drug Administration. So I think most people are aware, this is the agency that is tasked with providing scientific review and regulatory approval for drugs in the United States. This includes the 5 CFTR modulating drugs that are currently available in the United States, as well as 12 additional CF therapies that have been approved over the years. So again, those hit a broad spectrum of expertise at the FDA. And with more therapies in the CF pipeline than ever before, we really think it's critical that the FDA has the staffing and the resources to support the timely delivery of these innovative new therapies to patients. So the staffing at the FDA is a lot of experts in different areas, pulmonary, anti-infectives, in the new kind of gene therapy space, people who are coming in with new expertise in gene editing, gene delivery, the toxicology aspect. So there's this really comprehensive team that comes together to review every application that is submitted to the FDA, from the very early stages of getting an investigational new drug application and all the way through to the final approval process, and even in the post-market commercialization aspect. It's a group of very well trained people with very unique expertises that are really hard to replace, but are so critical to making sure that our food and drug supplies are safe and effective, and that we're approving things that really should be going out to the population and are poised to make a difference in the lives of people, in our case with CF. We can go to the next slide. So some of the ways that the FDA and the CF Foundation have worked together, again, just like the NIH, we don't receive money from the FDA. Everything that we do is really on a professional level and interactions with the agency. Over the past number of years, we've worked with them a fair amount on development of novel regulatory approaches to support clinical development and approval of CF drugs. Since the FDA historically has had fairly low turnover, you tend to be able to build relationships, and the people that are reviewing, the people that reviewed the original Kalydeco ivacaftor treatment that came through, many of those people were involved with the Orkambi approval, and then some of those carried over into the later Trikafta and Aleptrix. So you end up having this kind of longitudinal experience. That's so important for really understanding the patient community and how the drugs need to be approved, kind of some of the nuance with approving drugs, especially in a rare disease area. And this has been really, really critical for us. So some of the examples of ways that we've been able to engage with the agency that have really been useful for us in really kind of helping to benefit our population is having discussions with the FDA about label expansion for modulators without the need for a trial. This is the idea of theratyping, which really helped to expand. I believe or Combi was one of the first kind of ones that went through that process. But the agency interacting with us, interacting with Vertex, having that patient experience in there, and really being able to understand the nuances of our patient community allowed us to be able to work with the agency to get those additional mutations on label. This is something that is carried through to some of the newer drugs that have come on, rather than every single mutation having to be evaluated in a clinical trial, which is just not feasible. We've been able to have broader label more mutations on label because of that experience that we had with the regulators, because they were staffed, they were able to have the conversations and really kind of building that repertoire with them. So that's been something that we've been very successful with by having a robust agency. But again, I think it's something as we look forward and kind of these newer therapies, it's again something we want to make sure that the FDA is positioned to be able to have those conversations, be able to have the dialogue to continue to have those engagements. And another area that's, I think, incredibly important right now is the development of new clinical trial frameworks as we're evaluating new therapies. Again, a lot of what we're doing right now is different. And you can't just depend on the way the drug approval process has worked for maybe a really large indication like COPD or asthma even, and say, well, it works for them, it'll work here when it won't. And so we're able to have those conversations with the FDA. And so making sure that they have the room and the bandwidth and the staffing and the expertise to be able to engage in those creative ways is extremely important for what we are trying to do and for how we're trying to move the field forward. So again, as we're looking at the kind of next step of where the budgets are going and where Congress is willing to kind of place the money, these are the things that are really important to us for thinking about how important the FDA is for us accomplishing our mission, and also with the NIH. So making sure that they're in a position to be able to do what they're charged to do and not really being hindered due to budgetary constraints. If you can go to the next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Scott Sherwood, and he is going to tell you a little bit more about what you can do next. So thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. And just as you were going through that, it's just so helpful to be reminded of, we have some of the best and brightest researchers in the country, in the world, who are focused on cystic fibrosis and, increasing our understanding of the disease and helping us move forward to future treatments and therapies and advancements in CF care. And, unfortunately, all of that can be stalled, or the door can close on some of that progress when they don't have consistent funding for the programs and for research and through the projects that are funded by the National Institutes of Health, for example. So it's just a great reminder of why we need to jump into this, why we all need to advocate for the protection of these agencies and for consistent and robust funding for these programs. As we've talked about, the NIH and the FDA have been pivotal to the advancements we've made in CF care, and we must continue to invest in science and research to ensure that progress continues. And our work is well underway. We've already, through our advocacy alerts, our community members have sent in thousands of messages to their members of Congress, really kind of planting the flag for why robust funding is important to our community and why we're concerned with potential cuts. During the August recess, which just came to an end just a few days ago, really, we had almost nearly 20 in-district meetings. And I know we have a lot more that are on the books that are coming up. And so those are community members who are meeting their members of Congress back home and their staff when those members are outside of DC and they're back in their districts. And so those community members are scheduling meetings. They're working with our team to get the latest talking points to get prepped and ready, but they're having those conversations. They're sharing what they've seen in the world of CF, what progress they've seen, but underlying why we're not done yet, why we have to continue to invest in the NIH and FDA to ensure that we have future therapies that come down and help our patients and our friends and families impacted by CF. So great progress in those meetings. We've heard back from, getting some great intel, really opening the door to future conversations. And these are all coming at a really critical time. As Dave mentioned, the government is put in charge with coming up with a budget here in the next 20 days, either passing a new budget bill or a continuing resolution to keep the government open until we can get to a new budget. And so the time is now for us to really jump in on this fight. And so, our advocates have already done a great amount of work so far. Just want to put a plug out there that next week, actually, we have a group of researchers who are coming to DC. We've scheduled meetings with that they'll be joining meetings with us, with our team on the Hill, to inform legislators, to tell members of Congress, for those members of Congress to hear from experts of the impact of these potential cuts and why we need to continue to invest in these programs and to these agencies. So that's just another bite at the apple for us to raise awareness and for us to continue to advocate in support of these programs and these agencies. And so on the next slide, we've done a lot of work. There's a lot that we've already done to this point, but we're really asking each one of you to now take the time to jump in, to lend your voice, to advocate on protecting these programs. So I'll encourage each one of you to go to act.cff.org. So that's act.cff.org. And that's where you'll find all of our latest campaigns. All of our advocacy campaigns that are currently live are hosted on that website. So an easy way to see what we're focused on at the very moment. And in that top left corner, you're going to see our campaign to protect the NIH and the FDA. So once you click on that, put in your name, your address, it's going to pull up your members of Congress, and it's already got the phone script so that you're ready to, you can read through that phone script and get prepared and press the connect or dial the phone number that it provides you, and you'll be connected with your member of Congress's office and leave that voicemail or speak to that person who answers the call and reiterate and tell them why it's important that they protect these agencies. We also have the email that's already put on the campaign and is ready to be sent. It's always nice if you take just a moment to personalize that opening paragraph. You can say, I'm a constituent and a parent of someone with CF, or I'm one of your constituents and a researcher from the University of Florida, or wherever you are, to really just put a name and a specific personal piece to that type of outreach can really go a long way. And don't just send that message once, continue to send those messages, make those phone calls several times a week. It's really important to keep that drumbeat going, especially at this critical time, so that we're top of mind as these subcommittees and as members of Congress meet to discuss appropriations. And so this is the time for us to really continue that drumbeat, get the phone calls in, get the emails in. There's someone in the office, whether you get a response or not, there's someone there that is reading the emails, keeping a tally of who's sending emails, asking for support for appropriations for the NIH and the FDA, making those phone calls. So there's someone there that's calculating those and then bring that information to the member of Congress to discuss. So it's really important to get those calls in and to be consistent. That's how we're going to be our most effective, is for us to continue to be persistent and consistent over the next couple of weeks. And encourage other people to get involved. Your networks, your friends, your family members, your colleagues can take action as well. So you can provide this little keyword that we have. So text science to the number 96387. So once they send that phrase science to 96387, they'll get a link sent to their text message, and they can click that link, and that's going to bring them right to the Protect NIH FDA campaign. And so it'll have that synopsis of the issue, why funding impacts the CF community, and then I'll have that pre-written email all ready to go. So it's really a great way to get people involved. Again, the more the merrier here. We really need to get as many voices in as we can, and now is the time to do it. So encourage you to do that. I also want to flag, if you're a researcher on this call, once you're on act.cff.org, you'll see our story collection efforts. And so once you've taken action today, take a moment and click that story collection effort and just provide your name, and there's a box to share your concerns or your specific story or situation of how you could be impacted or your concern with impacts to potential cuts. These stories go a long way in informing our team of these really specific stories to help shape where we can share those stories. We have some idea of where cuts will be and the implementation, and the impact of those cuts, but hearing very specific stories coming from a specific, member of Congress's district, that can be really helpful for our team to share and to provide. So take a moment to complete that. It really builds and supports our advocacy efforts here at the foundation. And as we work towards getting these voices in, it takes one and all of us to make a collective effort to make the biggest impact as possible. And so, like I said, now is the time to do it. Once you're on act.cff.org, you also see our other campaigns. Dave mentioned the extension of the enhanced advanced premium tax credits, those APTCs. There's a campaign on that you can take action on. There's some other campaigns on there as well. We'll push those out at more critical moments, but you can feel free to send those messages, get those messages in at this point as well. But our top priority at the moment is definitely going to be protecting the NIH and the FDA. And so really want to encourage you to do that. Protecting these agencies is really securing the future of CF care. The NIH has put us in this position where we've increased our understanding of CF. The FDA has made sure that therapies are safe and effective before they're in the hands of patients, and we must continue to invest in these places. We need to continue to progress to make sure that we have treatments for our friends and family members. We've made a lot of progress, but there's currently 10 to 15% of our population who don't currently benefit from a CFTR modulator. We need to make sure that we have therapies and treatments for those folks. And our ultimate goal is to get to the point where we have a cure, and we're only going to get there through continuous funding for these agencies and for these programs so that we can get to the point where we have a cure for everyone with CF. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our National Volunteer Advocacy co-chair to share, what are, Brittney, I'd love to hear what you're planning on doing, your advocacy efforts over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And thanks so much, everybody, for being here. I first just want to echo the sentiments that Kirk shared at the top of the meeting, and just, how proud and how grateful we are for everyone in this community really rallying together earlier this year in the summer to make our voices heard on the cuts to Medicaid. Now is another one of those big times, and all hands on deck time, as you've heard. And so we've got our marching orders. I'm personally, even as a millennial who hates picking up the phone and talking to people, I'll be making phone calls every day as just part of my normal routine. If you've never done it before, I really encourage you to give it a try. It's could not be any easier. Scott mentioned the script is on actcff.org. And you really just, it takes 30 seconds. Encourage you to save the number for the congressional switchboard in your phone to make it that much easier for yourself. And you just share your thoughts, share what your concerns are. Someone's there to take note of that. 9 times out of 10, they really don't even engage back and forth with you much further than saying, "Hey, thanks so much for calling in." So it really, really is easy. And as a couple people have mentioned in the chat, there are people in those offices every single day, reading those emails, tallying those phone calls, and taking note of what we, the constituents, and the people in the CF community have to say. So whatever way you choose to advocate, just please do that. Make it consistent. Share it with your friends and your family members, your communities. I usually also put it on like my Instagram story once or twice a week, saying, "Hey, please, don't forget this is going on. This is important." If you have a very compelling personal story, share that as well. But we need as many people as possible making these phone calls, sending these emails, and getting in touch with our members of Congress to let them know that we do not want cuts to the FDA and NIH, and here's why. So again, just thank you all so much for being here, taking the time out of your day, for everything that you have already done for people with CF, and everything that I know that you will do in these next upcoming weeks and beyond. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Dave and our other friends at the foundation and the staff for some Q&A. So Dave, come on back.
Thanks, Brittney. And Thanks, Catherine and Scott, for sharing. We're going to open it up for a couple of questions. I don't see any, and please use the QA feature. I don't see any quite now, but we did get a couple submitted ahead of time. So I will go ahead and just take a couple of those. But please, we have a couple minutes. We're happy to take your questions. If we can answer them, we will. And if not, we will try to find an answer or get back to you individually. This sort of, Scott, I'm going to kick this one to you. It's sort of a perennial question. I'm going to boil it up to, I think for both, folks that I think we have, folks that live in places where the members of Congress are predominantly, in support of our issues. And this is a fairly common question we get, and I'm glad we got it again. And then we also have some folks where the folks are predominantly not supportive of our issues. And so, if your members are mostly Democrat or your members are mostly Republican, can you talk us through a little bit about what people can do? I feel like these questions, there's two of these, and without getting into specifics, I think for on both ends of that, people feel somewhat helpless, right? The folks that are in support of our issues are in the minority. They feel like they have no power. They can't do anything about it. The folks that are in the majority, are not supportive of our issue, and folks are feeling a little bit like they have no they have no say there. So what can people do? What's the best approach?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and always a good reminder of, you can kind of feel like you don't have an impact when, yeah, you're in a district where you already have the support of your member. What more can you do? Or in the opposite, you feel like you're speaking on deaf ears. I'd say in those places where you're pretty confident that you already have the support, it's still helpful to make that outreach because, that member wants to be reminded of what they're doing, what they're kind of getting up every day and doing and who they're supporting. And so sending those reminders actually kind of gives them either confidence, gives them the ammunition, reminds them of the stories back home of why they're doing what they're doing. And, if you're giving them great specific stories, they can use those stories when they talk to their colleagues on the Hill and say, hey, you're on this committee or you're on the other side of the aisle. I just heard this story. Those can be really helpful. So continue to remind and to support and to build champions with those who already are in support of our issues. That's one way to look at it on, one side. And then the other, when you're concerned that your outreach isn't going to make a difference, you can't stop. You really need to continue to make the outreach and, work every day to get closer to yes with that individual. And I'll share one quick anecdote. I mentioned we had some in-district meetings over the last couple of weeks, and I had someone who was pretty nervous. They're going to their first in-district meeting, and they're like, hey, I've read up on my member, and he's never really supported our issues. And it seems like he's very supportive of the proposed budget out there. What can I do? And so, I walked them through sharing the CF story, the progress we've seen in NIH. We have such a great story with the NIH and FDA, with our current policy ask. And so she went in and she had a great conversation. She actually met with the representative who's a member of the Appropriations Committee in the House. And she said, I didn't quite get to a yes, but, he really understood what I was talking about. And he said he's going to follow up with me once he gets back to DC and has his first committee meetings. And so, there's now a place to build a relationship and to, have a dialogue going forward. And so, maybe you're not going to get that complete support and change of mind in that first meeting or that first email or that first outreach, but use that as a point to build future conversations to get us there in the future.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. Thank you, Scott. I would just add, the folks that the folks that are thinking like, hey, my people are supportive of our issues, there's nothing I can do. I think now's the time for them to really stand up and fight harder. And I think it's okay to press a little bit. You have the President of the United States asking for a 40% reduction in, funding for the largest research institution in the world. And that is going to stop cures, medical cures for disease across the spectrum, including cystic fibrosis. Is going to it will slow it down, and we certainly don't want our leadership in the space to, the United States' leadership in the space to go backwards, to slow down. But more importantly, we want patients to have access to these advanced treatments and cures moving forward. And so, those that have said, "Hey, I'm with you," but my hands are tied, I'm in the minority, they can fight harder. There's things they can do. And they know what those things are. They just need some pressure. So, and I think it's okay for us to respectfully give it to them. I've got one here for Katherine, and it's a difficult. I think it's a little bit of a difficult question to sort of answer on specifics, but I think at the high level, have we seen any studies or research, NIH funded research in CF that has been cut, paused, that has slowed down as a result of what's happening at the at the federal level, and anything you can share on that and what you're hearing.
Yeah, Dave, I think this is a really important topic. And ever since we first heard about grants being terminated very early on in kind of the January, February timeframe, we've been very closely monitoring this, and I know working with your team as well on it. Fortunately, a very small number of grants we have been informed of in the CF space have been terminated as a result of the current administration's priorities. So that doesn't mean that won't change, but as of right now, we're doing pretty well. We do know a number of investigators who are CF adjacent or CF researchers with research in other spaces that has been impacted for a number of reasons. But as far as actual terminations on CF specific research, it has been very, very limited. And we've engaged with some of those investigators to see what we can do to make sure that the research is potentially able to be continued in a way that we're not just cutting it off midstream and we can still get the findings. So we're working with those on a case-by-case basis to see if there's any ways that we can help continue supporting that research. Also working with them to see if there are ways to go back in later, depending on the reason for the termination, on ways to reshape research programs so that maybe they are better aligned for continued funding in other ways. I would say, though, the more detrimental piece that we've been dealing with throughout most of this year is, as I mentioned, that grant cycle, and it's a long cycle. It takes many, many months, but we've had a number of researchers who had gone through the process of having a grant that scored well, would normally be approved for funding, and is just sitting in limbo. And that's something I don't think we've really experienced before. So it's grants that some of them we expected to be funded in the Q1 of this past year in 2025, and they're still waiting and do not have award letters, and they're hoping they come. But with the federal budget year ending at the end of this month, we don't actually know what that means. And so I think that's something we're a little more concerned about and continuing to monitor very closely, is those researchers who are banking on those grants to come through to keep their labs going and keep their research moving. What happens if those grants don't actually come through, or they're just continuously delayed? And so again, this is kind of uncharted territory, but I think from what we've seen, that's been the greater impact, less on grants actually being terminated. So
great. Very helpful. Thank you, Katherine, for that. So we've got a couple other questions going around on a few things that we covered here. Scott, one of these is like tips for working with legislators or for members that are not running again, that are sort of they're short timers, as we used to say when I worked in government. What any tips can you share with folks that how you might recommend them working with folks that are on their way out the door?
Yeah, I mean, typically when they're not running for re-election, they're a little freer with their thoughts and things that they can jump in and be a little bit more involved with. And so yeah, definitely reach out to those people, and while they're on their way out, they can still be effective. And I've seen, with those members who are not worried about re-election, sometimes they're looking for one more thing to get done and to kind of make a statement piece and to be, either branch out from their party or to stand out. They're looking for that one last kind of memorable moment. And, our stories, they can be a part of a big win with, protecting something like the NIH and the FDA.
Yeah, I think that's right. They've got nothing to lose, right? They're not running for re-election. They can't lose their re-election. I think we saw in this vote that, they took on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. You saw Tom Tillis, senator from North Carolina, decide not to run and then vote against the bill. He was uninhibited by the need to be reelected, and he did what he thought was the right thing, and that we thought was the right thing, was to vote against this bill. And there are several members like that, and there are many folks that are retiring. I think there's a slight difference with folks that are not running for re-election for the position they're currently in and are running for attorney general or governor, or, maybe they're going from the House to the Senate. So it's not the same across the board, but if they're retiring, everything Scott just said, I think is incredibly accurate. I think if they're running for like a higher office, they may still be somewhat bound to sort of their party agenda, but and that goes for both sides of the aisle. So, but in large part, they are freed up to do some to be a little bit more independent, and I think that's all real good advice. We've got time for like one more here, and I'm going to go ahead and take it. Somebody asked if we should be working at the state level with our state lawmakers. So not your members of Congress, but folks in your state legislatures. That's a great question, and the answer is perhaps. And as I noted at the top, the changes for in terms of coverage, Medicaid, marketplace, things like that, we're going to be working moving forward to try to mitigate impacts for people with CF. And if we think there's a need to engage you all in those discussions, we absolutely will, as we always do. And there might be an opportunity to talk to state lawmakers around the value of or the impacts of Medicaid, the value of the Medicaid program, and other things. I would say, as it relates to the NIH and the FDA, probably not as much, unless they're passionate. You have a relationship with someone who's passionate about research. They certainly have more of a direct line to federal lawmakers than you might. They tend to come together as parties back in the States a little bit more often, and they do tend to have some personal relationships. So it's not a terrible idea, but I think you're better suited for NIH and FDA going right to the members of Congress, generally speaking, and sitting tight and waiting for us to engage you when the time is right on state-based issues. So I think that's the last one we are going to take for today. We're coming at the top of the hour. I want to go ahead and just thank you all for being here again, and taking the time out of your days to listen, and to really, hopefully get some really good information to then turn back around and to share with your lawmakers why these agencies are so important. I want to thank Dr. Katherine Tuggle for joining us today and lending her expertise. Scott, for lending his voice, of Courtney, of course. But most of all, I want to thank our fearless leaders, Kirk and Brittney. Thank you for leading the charge for us across the country and engaging our advocates. And last but not least, to all of you, thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you do for our community, for people with CF every single day. Get on the phones. Let's protect the NIH and the FDA, and we'll see you out there. Thanks, everybody.